Okay, this is a momentous day. It's a big event. We've got a lot of speakers, and so we're going to get going. Welcome, and we are appreciative that you joined us this evening. We have over 500 registrants this evening, which is quite impressive. I want to offer my thanks to everyone who is on the panel this evening. They'll be introduced as we go on. And of course, everyone who worked on the Riverkeeper Close Indian Point campaign. My name is Paul Gallay. I'm the president of Hudson Riverkeeper. And starting tomorrow, after Indian Point closes, which is going to be at about 11 o'clock this evening, our region is going to be safer. We'll be farther along towards our goal of clean, renewable, and reliable energy. We'll be closer to productive use of the Indian Point site. Tonight is about taking stock of what we've achieved with the closure of Indian Point and why it is so important that the plant is closing. And of course, also where we go from here when it comes to restoring the site and fostering safe and clean energy in its stead. Again, we have a lot of speakers this evening. I'm not going to speak for any greater length of time. I'm going to keep things moving along and introducing the film that will set the stage for our program this evening, John Bowermaster's The Long Shadow of Indian Point.
So we're at the Indian Point nuclear power plant. We're about 34 miles north of Times Square, Midtown Manhattan. Within 50 miles of Indian Point, we have about 20 million people living and working. It's the highest population density of any nuclear plant in the country. You can have a catastrophic accident at Indian Point that would release enough radiation to make this entire region uninhabitable. What we're looking at is the two big concrete domes are the two operating reactors at the plant. They've been running since the mid-1970s. Most of the nuclear plants in the country are basically 1950s era atomic energy design. They haven't changed really a bit since then. Indian Point is a once-through cooling nuclear power plant. That means it's continuously taking in Hudson River water, cycling it through the plant, and then discharging it back out. We're talking about 2.5 billion gallons of water a day. Just to put in perspective, that's twice the amount of water the entire city of New York and its 9 million residents use every day. The effect is it kills over 1 billion fish and fish eggs and other aquatic life every year. It's been doing that every year for 40 years. All the waste that's ever been produced at this plant is still at this facility. If one of these fuel rods that's been taken out of the reactor, if you were physically within 100 feet of it, you would die within several minutes. That's how much radiation these things give off. It's going to remain toxic and radioactive for 250,000 years at least. Most of the spent fuel is in concrete pools, which are behind the reactors. 2 of those pools were leaking for 10 or 15 years. There are now 2 big underground plumes of highly radioactive contaminated water sitting under the plant, basically in the groundwater. Whether Indian Point stays open or closes, the cleanup of this site, the decommissioning is going to cost billions of dollars, and it's a contaminated industrial site. One of the big concerns we have here, and what we can see from being on the river and looking at the plant, is the fact that there is literally no security on the waterfront at this facility. And nuclear plants are supposed to be some of the best guarded critical infrastructure in the United States. There is no security boat at the facility. There are no guards visible. The only security is these buoys that are 300 yards out from the plant that mark out an exclusion zone that's supposed to keep people out. You know, we can't see it from here, but the spent fuel pool buildings are just basic cinder block buildings next to the reactors. They're not hardened, they're not pressurized containment buildings like the reactors. They're basic light industrial buildings. You can fly a plane upriver, you can clearly see both of those spent fuel pool buildings where there's 2,000 tons of this nuclear waste just sitting in pools. forget the reactors. The reactors are not the main target here. The spent fuel pools have 5 times the radiation that each reactor has, each spent fuel pool has. If you damage or drain that pool and that fuel is exposed, catches on fire, and that fire would release more radiation than we could handle. When people learn the facts about Indian Point, it's overwhelming to them, and I think they, without a clear path of what they can do as an individual, they're in a sense of denial. You know, given the risks, I think it didn't make sense to build the plant here even in 1973, and it certainly doesn't make sense to keep it operating now.
So as I said while we were waiting there, a short can be sweet. I love that, and I love that, Philip, you crammed so much information into there. And I like the fact that it holds up. That was 7 years ago or so, and the story, you hit all the salient points, and you know, we've used that film for years to educate people about Indian Point, and it holds up. So I've got a couple of specific questions for you, Philip, but I'll hold off until we get to the Q&A part. I'm going to introduce everybody first, if that's all right. Congressman Mondaire Jones joins us. Good evening, Congressman. How are you?
I'm doing well, John, and what a joy it is to be in such great company, celebrating a long-suffering yet ultimately successful campaign to fully decommission Indian Point, which is in our congressional district. I cover all of Rockland and central and northern Westchester County, and I'm so proud of the important work that you all have been doing in this effort, and to be with you on the other side of that campaign that I was running for Congress. Now, as a member of Congress, standing with you yet again in this important effort.
And Mondaire grew up in East Ramapo, raised in Section 8 housing and on food stamps in the village of Spring Valley. Single mother who worked multiple jobs. Before being elected to Congress in 2020, he worked in the U.S. Justice Department and later got his law degree from Harvard. He's a Rockland County native who now lives in Westchester. Paul needs no introduction, but we're going to give him an introduction anyway. President
Short one, I hope.
Yeah, short one. President of Riverkeeper, Paul and his team work to protect the Hudson River and the drinking water supplies for 9 million New Yorkers. Paul's dedicated himself to the environment movement since 1987 when he left private practice of law, another lawyer, and went to work for New York State Attorney General. In 1990, Paul began a 10-year stint at New York's Department of Environmental Conservation, where he brought hundreds of corporate and government polluters to justice. Paul subsequently spent, 11 years as president of Riverkeeper?
You bet.
Yeah. Laurie Seeman, also over in Rockland County. Is that right, Laurie? Environmental educator and activist. Laurie's Strawtown Studio in Haverstraw is a center for nature, art, and science discovery for the region. It wouldn't be an Indian Point conversation without Manna Joe, Sloop Clearwater's environmental director. Hello, Manna Joe. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, John.
Yeah.
So glad to be here.
You know, Manna Joe has been on this issue for a long time, even though she's very young, and also is an Ulster County legislator, so full-time jobs times 2 or 3. Riverkeeper's Director of Legal Programs, Richard Webster, I see Richard down there in the sunlight. Veteran of battles to close Indian Point, most recently working on a new agreement to make sure that Indian Point's decommissioning, and this is something obviously we'll talk about later, decommissioning is safe and could allow productive reuse of the site within 15 years. Carlos Garcia is in New York City this evening, I'm assuming. Energy planner for the NYC Environmental Justice Alliance. Carlos's work supports identifying high-impact renewable energy investment opportunities in low to moderate income communities and supporting energy transitions that lead to a low carbon pathway. Last but not least, you already saw Phillip Musegaas in the short film. Phillip is now down on the Potomac, Vice President of Programs and Litigation at the Potomac River Network. But Phillip, how many years were you at Riverkeeper?
I was there about 10.5 years. Yeah.
10.5 years.
Mhm.
And obviously led the group's efforts to close Indian Point going back now, well, more than 15 or 16 years. So we're going to explore more with Phillip when we get through some Q&A here. I guess if I can find the Q&A, I guess we'll start with the congressman. No, I think we'll start with Phillip actually. Hang on.
I'm ready.
You ready?
Sure.
No, actually, we are going to start with the congressman because the congressman is a busy guy. You've got a full agenda this evening?
I wouldn't be a congressman if I didn't.
Exactly. On a state level, New York's been very proactive in passing legislation to reduce its carbon emissions and replace fossil fuel energy generation with clean, renewable energy sources. Is there anything happening in DC, in Congress, that can help New York and the nation on this path to a cleaner energy future?
There is, and I appreciate that question. As many of you know, right now I'm focused on fighting for the American Jobs Plan that happens to address the climate crisis at the scale that the crisis demands. Of course, myself and other progressives in the Congress are pushing for an even larger investment than what President Biden has proposed. But my goodness, how proud I am of this president for recognizing that this needs to be a climate bill and that a climate bill can also create millions of jobs in the United States of America. As part of the Paris Agreement, President Biden has committed the United States to cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. And if we are going to do that successfully, we must do that. Mm. We need to invest even more than, as I mentioned, the $2 trillion that President Biden has proposed in the jobs plan. But also, part of that effort includes passing the Green New Deal for public housing, which would retrofit and repair 1 million housing units in this country. Means passing the Civilian Climate Corps Act, which is a federal jobs program dedicated to executing renewable energy and emissions reduction projects. And of course, building and upgrading public transportation, which includes local investments to electrify our bus fleet in Westchester and to invest in commuter rail in Rockland County, which I'm very passionate about doing.
And a lot of those programs that you just mentioned are going to come out of this infrastructure package dollars that we're hoping pass the Congress and the Senate. Obviously, your constituency in northern Westchester County is going to be impacted by the closing of Indian Point more than any other in the state. There's a loss of jobs, there's a loss of tax revenues, it's going to impact schools. How are you addressing your constituents when they ask about what's next in regard to those questions?
This is a serious challenge. And what I want people to know is that I'm committed to making sure that there is both significant and continued oversight in this process. That means, of course, making sure Holtec keeps its promise of keeping Entergy employees on the job, including employees with union affiliations. It means making sure that there's continued community input from local stakeholders like yourselves, as well as opportunities for members of our community to have their concerns heard on an ongoing basis. I'm also in conversations with my partners at the federal level, including Senators Schumer, now Majority Leader Schumer, and Senator Gillibrand to make sure that there is sufficient oversight of the decommissioning process and opportunities to make sure, as I mentioned, that members of the community who are most impacted especially have their voices heard.
And what we'll talk about safety a little later, but I thought I'd get your take on that. What about when people who live in the district, in the area near to the plant, are worried about the safety of the continued storage of these spent fuel rods, which, as Phillip addressed in the short film, those spent fuel rods can be quite dangerous. How do you assuage your constituents that things are going to be okay?
Yeah, well, I want people to know that they're going to have, and we do have, a member of Congress who's going to be fighting to make sure that those rods are, first of all, encapsulated in a way that is safe, that creates safety and security for people in the surrounding areas. And then obviously the elephant in the room is, what do you do with it? And so, we have to continue to wrap our minds around that important project. How do you transport these spent fuel rods in a way that is safe and when you relocate it, where do you relocate it? So, but I think the most important thing right now is to make sure that they are stored safely.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Congressman, for joining us, and have a good rest of the night, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you so much for your advocacy.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Great. Phillip, you're up next, my friend.
Right, John.
How did Riverkeeper first get involved in the protest of Indian Point's opening? Did it begin? It opened in 1962. Did the Riverkeeper start protesting, immediately?
The history of this campaign goes back to when the plant was first licensed. I mean, I know there were hearings back in 1971, 1972, relating to Indian Point 2 and 3 being built, where the Hudson River Fishermen's Association was already raising concerns. And then as time went on and Riverkeeper was founded in 1982, this became, the original fight was over the location of the plant and the fact of having nuclear power so close to New York City, even in the era when nuclear power was seen as a panacea for a lot of energy concerns. But as time went on, and Riverkeeper's involvement early on had to do with the impact on the river, of course. The Hudson River Fishermen's Association and Riverkeeper started by commercial fishermen who were seeing their livelihoods, their commercial fisheries, just being devastated by Indian Point and by other power plants. Are you all hearing me okay? I just want to make sure my internet is good. Yeah, okay. And so I think the initial big push, big concerns had to do with the fact that, as I said in the short film that you so beautifully made, this plant has been having a devastating impact on the river, killing billions of life forms a year for decades now, and that affected the shad fishery, the striper fishery, you name it, river herring, any fish populations that passed by there were impacted. And then after that, I think the campaign went through a lot of changes. We had, I think there were always concerns about the evacuation plan, just the nonsensical nature of limiting a plan to 10 miles around the plant when you have New York City 34 miles away. We had concerns, of course, security concerns after 9/11. Concerns about the spent fuel began to grow, and the more we learned about how that was stored and that there was no solution to it. And then we had the Fukushima disaster in Japan, which I think kind of reignited a lot of the debate, certainly the region-wide debate and national debate over nuclear power. I think the campaign started with the fish, honestly, and the impact on the river, which seems right in a way, and then it took on all these other issues and brought us to where we are.
And the line in the film that I borrow from you with some frequency is this sense of denial, because as potentially bad as an accident or could be, people continued to 20 million people continued to live within its reach, and we went about our business. It was just, I think when you and I talked about it previously, it was just too big to comprehend. You just couldn't imagine the enormity of what would go wrong if it went wrong. So,
that was always a challenge. I think communicating those facts to the public without immediately causing them to kind of shut down and just not want to hear anymore, which is human nature, unfortunately, in some ways. And I think over time, part of this, there are many reasons why this campaign was successful. I think one is, we documented the problems at the plant very well, and I think very objectively. And we documented our concerns and the public's concerns with the evacuation plan and the lack of readiness. The Westchester County at one point was really basically admitting that they didn't have faith in the plan. New York State, certainly Governor Cuomo didn't. But I think kind of our perseverance and just kind of, very rationally just telling people, here's what the plan says, here's what's going to happen, think about that. I think that's over time that penetrated to people. And one thing I will say about the plan, and just in general about this campaign and nuclear plants in general, is it shouldn't be this hard to close a plant like this. These plants are, for better or worse, nuclear power and nuclear reactors are inherently dangerous. And one thing I learned over all this time is certainly a state governor who's entrusted with the safety of the citizens of New York should have the authority under the right circumstances to take action. And so there's a lot of interesting legal questions around these kinds of things that hopefully we will not have to resolve. So
great, thank you, Philip.
Yeah, sure.
Paul, you're up there in the corner.
Hey, John.
As of I guess 11 p.m. tonight, the nuclear energy will no longer provide electricity to the grid. We're entering a period in our near and near future that we're going to become ever more electrified across the United States, and including here in New York, and many people, as you know, are suggesting that the loss of the electricity generated from Indian Point is going to cause shortages, and that burning natural gas to replace it is going to become inevitable. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the most important thing for someone to know who's wondering about replacement energy is that we gave ourselves over 4 years to prepare for this day, and prepare for this day we have. As we sit here right now, we're burning 10% less natural gas for electricity than we were when we signed the agreement in January 2017. And that is principally because we are going big, not just on renewables, but on energy efficiency. Renewables is what gets all the headlines and the photos, but energy efficiency has been extraordinary. Around the country, we've cut our demand by 7-8% despite growth in population, despite economic growth. And in New York, we started preparations for closing Indian Point in 2012. The Public Service Commission, the state's chief energy regulator, began closure preparations with a contingency order for local utilities to study alternatives a decade ago. Then in 2016, New York adopted a clean energy standard, which requires a ramp up to 50% renewable energy by 2030. In 2018, the Public Service Commission ordered utilities to triple their energy efficiency programs, spurred in part by Riverkeeper and NRDC's 2017 report, which illustrated how energy efficiency alone could replace the power generated by Indian Point. Most significantly, New York put itself in a position to be a national energy leader by enacting the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which ups the requirement for renewable energy to 70% of our power by 2030. That same year, to cut emissions from old, inefficient fossil fuel-based power plants, DEC enacted the peaker plant rule. Last year brought additional energy efficiency mandates in 2020, a new state law to expedite the siting of large renewable energy projects and benefit host communities. So this is a decade-long planning effort that will close Indian Point 3 times over. And that's not even including the offshore wind, which kicks in starting in 2024. By 2028, Indian Point will have closed 4 times over. We're actually ahead of schedule for dropping our carbon power by 70% by 2030. So
So
we're well on the way. We've been busy.
You're not worried you're going to get up tomorrow morning and go to flip the lights on and they won't turn on?
You know, the people responsible for the grid have said we have all the reliability we could possibly need to close Indian Point. We don't need new gas-fired power plants in New York City or at Danskamer, and nobody's going to notice the difference. You're going to wake up and it's going to feel like it felt the night before, except you're going to be much safer, and that's going to continue.
So minus Indian Point, Indian Point's gone. How is that going to improve the health of the environment in both the river and the Hudson Valley? What are the environmental gains?
Well, this plant at 60, as Phillip has explained in your film, there's been significant leakage of radioactive water from the spent fuel pools. That remediation begins starting probably in June after the plant transfers. Richard Webster will tell you more about that. The spent fuel, which is so much the Achilles heel of this plant from the standpoint of safety in case of an accident or attack, that's going to get moved over by 2024 to dry cask storage. And again, don't want to steal Richard's thunder, but that's just a huge improvement in our safety and in environmental conditions on the site. Many of you know, as Phillip alluded to in his answer, that we began our campaign with the fact that the plant is destroying millions of fish and well over 1 billion fish eggs and larvae every year. Starting tomorrow, the Hudson can start to recover from the decades of damage done to it by the plant. And of course, by eliminating the risk of accident involving the operating reactors, by starting to move the spent fuel and do the decommissioning and get the radiation off-site, we're all going to be safer. The environment, the river, the shoreline communities are all going to be in better shape because of the elimination of that risk that has been so roundly proved to be significant and sufficient to justify the closure that we're about to see happen at 11 o'clock tonight.
Well, you alluded a couple times to your colleague at Riverkeeper, Richard Webster. So maybe we'll talk to Richard about the Holtec International, which is a company based in Jupiter, Florida, with a history of decommissioning, but not a particularly great record on decommissioning. So maybe Richard, you can bring us up to speed on what's next for the site itself.
Absolutely. Can you hear me? I'm getting some confusing messages about muting. Yeah, good. Okay. So yes, Holtec, not our favorite company. They've had a history of, well, we called it lies, bribes, and risk taking. So that was not a particularly complimentary line. And so we were very worried when they were coming in. And we really wanted to make sure that if they came in, we had some good assurances and a good legal agreement to make sure that the decommissioning would be done in a way that was acceptable. The state, I mean, obviously the NRC, let's just go, I think, you know, it doesn't need to be said, perhaps it doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it anyway. One of the problems with fighting nuclear plants is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is entirely in the pocket of the industry. They pay lip service to input from the public, but actually they really don't listen. You know, they may have a hearing, but they don't have a listening, right? So what that means is that unless, even when you get into the formal process, which is hard to do, you really just wait till you lose. You know, I joke that the issue isn't do you win at the NRC, the issue is how long does it take to lose. Mm-hmm. So we knew the NRC weren't going to protect us here, and indeed they didn't. They basically rubber stamped the Holtec transfer. And to add insult to injury, they then allowed Holtec, they granted Holtec this exemption rather, which would allow Holtec to take $700 million out of the decommissioning fund, spend it on working on spent fuel management, which is not what the decommissioning fund is for, claim that money back from the Department of Energy, but then not put it back into the decommissioning trust fund. So the NRC sold us out completely, and happily, with the help of some state representatives, including Sandy Galef and Pete Harcum, we were able to make some progress in the state PSC proceeding. Initially, Holtec and Energy sort of claimed that there was no jurisdiction. We managed to get jurisdiction clarified, and so it was clear there was jurisdiction. And then under that process, a negotiation was convened, a multi-party negotiation in which we were a partner. I'm subject to a confidentiality agreement, so I can't tell you what happened in that negotiation, but I can say, I think that if we hadn't been there, there are some things that wouldn't be in the agreement. So the agreement broadly, the first thing, big picture on the money, two big picture items on the money. One is that they have to put at least 50% of the money they spend on spent fuel management back into the trust fund. And if the trust fund is running short of money, they have to go up to 100% of that money. So we got that money, that $700 million back, and it's available for decommissioning.
Is the total trust fund, what's the amount of that? Is it at the $3 billion?
It's about 2.3 billion right now.
Okay. And
so that's about a third.
I would imagine Holtec's in business. They would like to keep some of that 2.3 billion for themselves.
They absolutely would. And you know, I guess ultimately the bargain is if they can get the job done properly and safely and promptly, then you know it's for decommissioning, and ultimately they will benefit from that. I don't really have a problem with that. I think the question is, what we need to make sure is that we have the oversight in place to make sure the job is done properly. So the agreement that we eventually came to, it not only has some assurance on the financial side for decommissioning, but it also has separate assurance on the financial side for the site, what's called site restoration, basically the cleanup of these radioactive pools that were mentioned in the radioactive groundwater that were mentioned in the film, and also non-radiological cleanup. So there's a bond that Holtec have put up of $110 million for that. So that's sort of the financial side. Then we have kind of the oversight side, which is what this does, this agreement, is it really puts the state in the driving seat for oversight. The state gets to sit in on monthly project meetings that Holtec hold regarding progress. The DEC can send inspectors onto the site to check out the cleanup progress, and the state is also recognized, and Holtec has recognized, that the state can form what's called a decommissioning oversight board to overlook what is happening on the decommissioning and ask questions of Holtec, which they will have to answer, and then provide those answers to the public.
But that board does not exist at this moment.
Right. It does not exist at this moment, but the agreement recognizes that it will be constituted, and we've heard actually from the Department of Public Service that it's going to be constituted fairly quickly. And Holtec has recognized that the Department of Public Service has a right to constitute that board.
And what rights, if any, do groups like Riverkeeper and Clearwater and others get? Do you get any kind of seat at the table in regard to watchdogging?
Yes, I mean, so there's going to be some representation of environmental groups on that board.
Okay.
And then, John, perhaps I should just say, I mean, there's a lot to fit in here, but one thing I want to mention on the spent fuel is the way I look at it is, you know, step one is stop making more of it, right? Because spent fuel is this ongoing problem. We really can't do anything with it beyond store it on the site at the moment. So the step one is to stop making more of it. Step two is to get it out of the spent fuel pools. And then step three is to figure out, well, what are we going to do with it in the long term? Is it going to sit on the site? Is it going to stay in those casks forever? What's going to happen? And I think we already have stopped making more of it tonight. We already have an agreement to take it out of the spent fuel pools. But the missing link is we still need to work on, you know, what's going to happen to it once it gets into the dry cask storage.
Which is a perfect lead into Manna Joe, who maybe can talk to us about what that decommissioning process is really like. You know, I know you know. What are the steps involved? What's going to happen 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, or what do you expect and hope to happen?
Well, as Richard said, the first thing is to by shutting down the facility, we're not making more waste, but there's over 2,000 tons of highly radioactive nuclear waste in the form of so-called spent fuel, but that fuel is actually far more radioactive than the fuel rods before they go into the reactor. They come out as a result of the fission reaction, which generates heat and makes electricity, but extremely highly radioactive. Some of the fuel we've been using is what's called high burn-up fuel, or they've been using for the last decade or so, and that's even hotter and more radioactive. Right now it's being stored in overcrowded fuel pools. It will be moved to dry cask storage, but many of us have concerns about that storage itself. And then a few other things that we have concerns about in what's called their post-shutdown activities report. After the plant is closed and as the waste is being moved out of the fuel pools to dry cask storage, the buildings will actually be deconstructed. The internals will be taken apart, and that process releases a lot of radioactive dust, cutting up highly radioactive buildings and equipment. And the plan is to put them on a barge, to build a dock to be able to put those radioactive equipment on a barge and send it to a dock in New Jersey, and then I believe ship it by rail across the country. And we believe that that process of transportation just for the equipment, let alone the very highly radioactive fuel rods, poses a danger not only to Indian Point and the surrounding community, but all the communities along the way, to send that waste to a waste storage facility in Texas. Holtec owns a waste storage facility in New Mexico, and ultimately their plan is to ship that highly radioactive waste fuel to their, what they're calling consolidated interim storage. And that we believe is even more dangerous. So you've got 2,000 tons of highly radioactive nuclear waste on site. And I think one of the first things that the Decommissioning Oversight Board needs to do is to bring in independent experts to really use a consensus building process to understand how dangerous that is. One of the things I mentioned with the release of radioactive gases and dust during decommissioning is monitoring. That the monitoring doesn't just need to be done at the perimeter of the site, which is currently the case. It needs to be done where the work is going on to assess the impact on workers, but it also needs to be assessed at a distance. There's an elementary school not far from the site. And the other thing I want to mention is that there is a high pressure gas line, several, that either go under the site or adjacent to it. And the Public Service Commission has acknowledged that that pipeline should likely be shut down during decommissioning with heavy equipment on the site. So this is an extremely complicated process. We've made a lot of progress, and indeed New York has the most protection of any other, or Indian Point does, any other reactor community. But we still have a long, long way to go and many unanswered questions. And I think that the Decommissioning Oversight Board is really the right place to get to the bottom of these questions and ensure that Indian Point is closed and decommissioned as safely as possible. And all of those things I just mentioned are just some of the questions that were raised during the public hearing comments. So, and raised by educated elected officials who may not even agree with the closing of Indian Point, but now that it is closing, want to ensure it's closed as safely as possible. There are many other questions, but that's just a sampling of our concerns.
Thank you, Manna Jo. Yeah, and I have many questions for you. Someone suggested to me last week that, of course, that gas pipeline, the AIM pipeline that runs just near to Indian Point, is there for a reason. And that's, you know, if the plant were ever to be turned into a natural gas burning plant, then they have access via pipeline right there.
I think that's a really dangerous idea. It had been floated a while back, but I do think, I think that the gas pipeline was very unfortunate to have that sited and built and expanded there. But I do think there's real opportunity for renewable energy with storage, because you've got transformers and high voltage power lines. We think the same is true of Danskamer. If we're really going to transition to a renewable energy economy and meet the goals of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, we have really excellent places to do things like solar generation and storage, in addition to what Paul mentioned about energy efficiency. Yeah. So we can take leadership.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect lead in to Carlos, because I would like to talk to Carlos. You know, Carlos, I think you'll agree with me that the one thing that man and women have done very well since he and she could walk is burn stuff. You know, that's what we know. But those days are winding down. You know, the burning of fossil fuel is not going to be our prime. One day, hopefully soon, it's not going to be our prime energy provider. But storage is an issue. How do we fix that? What are the next steps in creating alternative energies and storing alternative energies?
Yeah, great, and thanks so much for having me. And it's a real pleasure to be working alongside these amazing individuals that are panelists, and just hearing them, and like, congratulations to them all who've been doing this for such a long time. It's a long time coming. So yeah, very, very honored. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, right? And you're completely right. You know, taking a step back and looking at this even further and understanding a lot of the negative externalities that come from all that burning that you talked about. Climate change is really how it started and continues to feel, we continue to feel its effects by the way that we generate, transmit, distribute, use, and dispose of energy. And the only way we're going to stop a lot of those, or help mitigate a lot of those effects, are changing the way that we generate, dispose, transmit, use of energy. So, you know, one of the things, and also, you know, speaking to energy efficiency, which to Paul's point, he's completely right, is a massive lifesaver for New Yorkers and on a variety of different levels. But Local 97, which was passed also in 2019, most aggressive energy efficiency bill in the world for commercial building spaces. And, you know, if you've been in New York City, which I'm sure most of us here have, you understand that the majority of the space is commercial buildings, most of them very, very old and very inefficient. So that bill is specifically meant to target, and NEJA and a lot of our allies, we sit on a lot of those advisory panels talking about the market designs, the programs, how building owners are going to get there, so on and so forth. So, you know, I think to talk about the replacement of how we're going to go from a dirty pollution source like nuclear energy with some really bad waste problems to more cleaner solutions, I think, you know, a lot of those solutions are already in play. You know, for us here at NEJA, we're a membership organization of 11 different organizations here in New York City, all environmental justice organizations and community-based organizations from low to middle income communities. They're doing some amazing projects. You have the largest community solar array in the state of New York is being developed by Uprose, one of our members in the Sunset Park region. You have one of the largest, or actually I believe the largest solar array in New York City being developed in the Bronx by the Point CDC, also one of our members. You have us in the NYSO regulatory spaces talking about market design, about how we're going to better fit, value, and integrate energy storage, offshore wind, solar, all these different types of clean energy assets, how we're going to be able to value them and make the market signals more positive and more lucrative so that developers, community-based organizations, environmental justice organizations can really be at the forefront of this clean energy transition. And by focusing on them and putting them, the people who've been most marginalized, most hurt, most polluted, right? I know I saw in some of the chat people talking about asthma rates, right? There's a reason why in northern Manhattan it's called Asthma Valley, right? Because of the different types of pollution sources. So putting them at the front of the line to reap these benefits, to be the locations for a lot of this clean energy tech, that's what a just transition is, right? So when we transition from dirty nuclear or natural gas or jet fuel, like a lot of the peaker plants in New York City run on, to cleaner tech, and making this, instead of just a transition, we're going to make this a just transition, which is very different. And that's really what we've been, like Paul said, we've been doing for years. Unfortunately, not fast enough, but we're holding everyone's feet to the fire, of course. And again, I'm really proud to be up here with all these different panelists who've been doing this for such a long time.
I'm going to press you a little bit on a question, a generational question. Most of us on the panel probably got our education about our concerns about nuclear energy from 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl, or films like the China Syndrome, which were like horror films and horror stories. But a couple new generations, younger, may not have that embedded. And the younger generation, I think, when asked about their biggest concerns about the future is climate change and carbon in the atmosphere. And there is an argument made by pro-nuke folks that, nuke's not so bad, it doesn't put carbon in the atmosphere. And a lot of young people, I hear them say that there is a next generation of nuclear coming. I mean, am I making that up, or do you get that sense when you talk to your younger peers?
I think, and I appreciate that you're not putting me in with those younger peers. I still consider myself quite young, so I'm not gonna take any offense to the slight of, but I think you may be a little bit wrong, to be honest with you. I think when you look at the different types of solutions that me and people who are younger, the real younger leaders that are really leading a lot of these movements and a lot of these discussions here in New York City, when you talk about the actual physical constraints, and of course, right, the biggest negative externality really with nuclear is its byproduct of waste. As we talk about, it's a non-renewable, it's a never-ending. When we're talking about the lifespans of thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years that this material is going to be decaying, it's simply almost impossible, right? I mean, look at Yucca Mountain, right? There's such an issue with trying to figure out how to make this alternative work, that when we have so many different viable options, just like the ones that I told you about, but even looking at energy demand side, instead of talking about how can we make more energy, how can we make the energy demand that we are right now demanding smaller, right? Energy efficiency, demand response, demand side management, real-time energy management practices for commercial buildings. So many different options that we have on our table that don't revolve around the very sticky issue of the byproduct of this might kill you some way or another, or may affect fisheries, or may affect groundwater contamination, or may affect, there's so many different options that we have now that when we look at the different types of options and the different solutions and the different things that we look at as being a pillar for environmental justice, nuclear energy is never really at the forefront or even really in the discussion, and I think for good reason. So again, NEJA has always taken the position that we would be behind the closing of Indian Point if it meant no new construction of fossil fuel infrastructure to meet the demand. That's exactly what was put in place by the diligent workers like Paul Gallay and everyone else at Riverkeeper, and we stand behind them and supported them for years. And we're extremely happy to see this be the outcome. And like I said, there's not enough renewable energy in New York State right now. We're always pushing for it. We've made laws to mandate it, but now the tough part is really getting it done.
Yeah. Well, thanks for representing your generation. Laurie Seeman, last but not least, you spend a lot of time educating children all about the natural world that surrounds them. What's the downside of that? I mean, how do you give kids optimism when they, especially when you talk to them about the harms of a place like Indian Point, which kills a billion fish a year? How do you keep them positive and pointed in the right direction?
Thanks, John. Yeah, we've been on a really beautiful journey of finding our way with that. So first, I'd like to express gratitude for this opportunity to bring awareness to the youth in today's momentous gathering. And I want to thank all who've looked out for the future generations when working the long hours to see this through. This is a very good time to ask, what can we do different? And I believe education and educating our youth to be true inhabitants of where they live. They have not had that type of education. And it's time to return to that. They enjoy it. It's hands-on. It's, orienting. So I first began my work with youth years ago when I saw that they were in school and they were learning about the perils of the earth. And at the same time, the earth was being sold out from underneath of them at an alarming rate. They were being set up for inheriting the responsibilities. They would become theirs, but they didn't have a voice. I've endeavored to give a voice to the youth and to our local natural environments. That's been my work of the last 20 years. I teach in something which is called place-based education. And so first I'll tell you about our place, which is what this evening is about. That's why I'm here. For the past 20 years, I've worked with youth on both sides of the Hudson River Wide Bays area, Haverstraw, Croton, and Tappan Zee Bays, Hudson River miles 20 to 40, through our Strawtown Studio environmental arts programs. Riverkeeper's John Lipscomb once said to me, if you could lift the lid off the Wide Bays area of the Hudson, you would be amazed by all the life you would see. He said the Wide Bays area is a prime nursery, wintering, and feeding ground for the life of the river. I've since learned that this area is designated by New York State as the most significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat of all 40 deserts in the Hudson. This is the mixing bowl between the sea and the fresh water. It's where the water comes down from the mountain streams. It's shallow, so sunlight reaches the bottom and plant life grows and provides habitat. The murky water is not dirty. It is nutrient laden. It is brackish life supporting water. This area is essential for the whole East Coast fisheries. And yet Haverstraw Bay is located directly south of Indian Point by 3 miles. The aquatic life has been harmed for decades. Impingement, thermal plumes, nuclear releases. And this is now ending.
But Laurie, how do you give kids optimism when you tell them?
That's what I'm going to tell you next.
Okay, good.
This is the way we tell the stories that educate the youth in our programs. First, appreciation and gratitude, then the challenges, and then what actions we need to take. An action for Haverstraw Bay is that it needs more layers of protection. When Haverstraw Bay is protected, we will make sure that nothing like Indian Point can ever land in the area again. So for years, I've been working with my longtime teaching partner, Joanna Dickey, and teaching children that life is rooted in place. Right now, we're teaching youth of Haverstraw. We're taking them to the headwaters, down to the river, putting them in waders, putting the earth into their hands, and teaching them about the social and historical and scientific life of the area. And they're learning that the river is more than a meandering band of water that flows through the valley. They're learning to become inhabitants of their place, and they're learning to discover how we all fit together for carrying forth. It's no more an education of individualism in school. It's a complete complement of education. But here comes the difficult part. We know that youth all over the world are in despair over the climate. And when we begin to ask the youth, where does our water come from? Where is it flowing to? And what does it need? Few know. This is what needs to change. And through telling them, sad truths must emerge. And what do we tell them about the sad side of the environment? We need to help them see the bigger picture. We need to help them see that the problems usually stem from the premise of human need. And we help them to imagine beyond the problems. And that is where the art comes in. The importance of art and creative thinking, the role it plays in innovation, is the basis for change, and it holds true for science too. We show them how art also helps in breaking away from precedent. It helps change our belief systems. We learn not to take from the earth, but to give back. The humans have created the toxic problems, and now we have the power to reimagine, to undo them. This is the work of teaching our youth. We can't let them get caught in despair. Recently, a student from a local school environmental club said to me, he joined the club because he didn't want the world to end. 8th grade. To this we say, when we feel pain for the world, we know we are connected. It is evidence. If we were not connected, we wouldn't feel the pain. Pain is a signal. Something is wrong. It gives us the clarity to see and the power to take action. Those are the words of Joanna Macy. She's one of our mentors. I see someone in the chat acknowledge Joanna Macy. She's a first-generation no nuclear activist, a spiritual ecologist, and she leads workshops. Also largely contributing to the youth's despair is not seeing many leaders or many adults take action. There are people, but they're usually not connected to the people taking action. We've been working on that. Last month, we set up one of the youth to speak at a conference on water along with decision makers. We teach them tools for change. A simple tool is to try striking the word use from our vocabulary. The minute you take out the word use, you are now moving past a utilitarian view of the world. You now begin to reach for more relational words. It's very simple, but a profound change. Over time, I realized it's not enough to educate the children. We must also take care of the world they live in too. So many of you know, I participated in the end of desalination. There'll be no desalination on Haverstraw Bay. It took 9 years. Got quite an education doing that, which I bring to the children. Founded the Sparkhill Creek Watershed Alliance, now 11 years old. What we've learned through water monitoring and working with Riverkeeper, our strongest partner there. We've learned about watershed planning and such, and we bring that into the education for the children.
Yeah.
And this form of bringing it back to the children creates a whole system for education. It's place-based education. We actually teach this now. We've done teachings for 2 years. I've taken 50 teachers, educators, naturalists, artists, activists through the trainings.
Yeah.
In 1981, I spent time making a film in 3 Mile Island. When I came to Rockland County after that, my first question was, who's doing something about Indian Point?
Yeah. Laurie, I've got to jump to, because we have a pile of questions here, and but one of them relates to what you just mentioned, and that is there are 2 other nuclear power plants in New York State. I'm going to ask, I guess, Paul or Richard, are there plans to ask those plans to close as well, or are they protected by Governor Cuomo's okay?
Well, that's something that I think Manna has some thoughts on. I will say that Riverkeeper is focused on Indian Point. We're focused on our watershed. We're focused on the risk that this plant poses in its location. It's focused on the damage that it's been doing to the Hudson and the threat it poses to our communities. And in all honesty, we are not focused on the upstate plants. We're focused on Indian Point. It's been quite a job, and the decommissioning and spent fuel management, still quite a job. So that's us, but that's just us. So again, I think Manna has some thoughts.
Yeah, I want to say that the plants in Western New York are still receiving a nuclear subsidy, so they'll be operating for another, I think it's about 8 years. And it was a $7.6 billion nuclear subsidy. What we can do is help those communities to understand what we've learned from our experience at Indian Point. We're part of a national decommissioning working group that's looking at these hard questions. And the other thing I want to say is that this upcoming decommissioning oversight board, which we brought to Senator Harcum and Assembly Member Gallay as an idea, and they even improved it by, instead of it just focusing on Indian Point, it is an oversight board that will work for the decommissioning when they are decommissioned in Western New York as well. So the state agencies will all stay the same, but the local representatives will be from that region in Western New York. So I think the main thing we can do is help bring our experience and all that we've learned from working on closing Indian Point and now the safest possible decommissioning. We can bring that information to them and support their efforts.
Richard, a question about Holtec. Could Holtec propose building a new nuclear reactor, a small next generation reactor on that site?
Well, luckily we actually did have that in the agreement, which is basically Holtec have agreed not to apply to site a new reactor at the site unless the local towns, the county and the state agree. So we have the state and the local, particularly Westchester County, to lobby if Holtec ever decide they might want to put a nuclear reactor there. So I think those are, I'd rather put my eggs in those baskets than in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
You know what, this is a little bit of a throwback, but what were the arguments for keeping it open? Why would we want to keep a leaky nuclear power plant on the shores of the Hudson? What was the argument for keeping it open? You know, the jobs, right? Yeah. Legitimate
revenues for the local towns.
Yeah.
Nuclear is low carbon, so that's the other argument. So those are basically the arguments. But I mean, I think what Manna said about the upstate reactors is important, because what it shows is that without a subsidy, Indian Point wasn't going to remain open.
Well, and this is for anyone, maybe Paul, could Indian Point qualify as a Superfund site?
Well, Superfund has more to do with chemical contaminants than radiological contaminants. And I think that the Superfund law is not applicable. It's the laws under the Nuclear Regulatory Code. And so one of the things that's worth saying about the closure agreement that we helped negotiate is that it requires stricter cleanup standards down to 10 millirems of radiation in the groundwater, which is a state standard, as opposed to the federal standard of 25 millirems. So we are going to count on the state's controls on radiological materials and the federal controls on radiological materials more so than the EPA Superfund law.
Right. I mean, effectively, it's become a state Superfund site under this agreement.
Yeah, and just to be clear, who funded that $2.3 billion trust fund? Ratepayers?
Well, ultimately, I mean, NYPA put the money in, but NYPA were paid by the ratepayers.
And then we're going to move away from nuclear a little bit. Who wants to talk about the fish population of the Hudson? What's going to be the recovery result of not having Indian Point in operation?
So I'm happy to take that, and Philip, you may have some thoughts about it as well. You know, we hired some very reputable scientists to study the impact of this plant and came up with the numbers that Philip and I have both given previously, which is millions of adult fish a year and literally 1.2 billion juveniles, larvae, and eggs a year destroyed by this plant. We've got 9 of our 13 keystone species in the Hudson have been in decline, and Indian Point is a big reason. As a matter of fact, we began this campaign in 1965 when Bob Boyle, Riverkeeper's founder, who wrote at the time a sportsman's column in Sports Illustrated, found that the state was hiding pictures of all the fish that were being destroyed by the Indian Point plant, got those pictures revealed. This was before the Freedom of Information law. And that began a realization of the damage being caused. 1980, in the agreement that ended the Storm King project, we were given a lengthy series of tests and evaluations and studies. We called it the Long River Survey, the Hudson River Biological Monitoring Survey. And one of our goals is to see that survey continue so we can see restoration rates and we can see what other measures are necessary, whether it's controlling invasive species, whether it's controlling bycatch and limits on commercial and recreational fishing, so that we can actually turbocharge the restoration in biodiversity that the closure of Indian Point can help start.
Richard, I'm going to go back to you. I've seen the words you used. You repeated them tonight. That Holtec has a reputation for obfuscation and perhaps even lying. Why should we trust them? Why should we trust that they're going to do a good job?
Well, I don't think we're I don't think we're actually trusting them. I think we're checking them. We're making sure that they do a good job through good oversight. I mean, we got to the point where it was very close to the reactor closing. We either had a choice of well, I'm not sure we had a choice, but the choice that the state was faced with was reject Holtec and then have the reactor go into safe store, or take Holtec and put a lot of guardrails around Holtec. And I think we and the state decided that with the appropriate guardrails, we could live with that. We don't love it. But that this is not an area where there are that many companies involved. So for one reason or another, there is not a lot of competition in this space. We don't have a lot of choices. So sometimes we have to deal the cards that we're handed. And I think that with the safeguards that we've got in place, I mean, this is going to be the highest profile decommissioning contract that Holtec have. If they mess this up, the chances are their decommissioning business will be defunct. So they have some pretty good incentives to get it right.
That may be the understatement of the evening. If they mess this up, it'll be disastrous results. I mean, because, and Manna Joe, maybe you can go back to this. I mean, what are the risks of decommissioning? I mean, what are the physical day by day? Because they're going to be taking these spent fuel rods, moving them across site into a cask. This is all done by man, I assume. Not a lot of robots, not a lot of AI there. Man has a tendency to make errors. I mean, how concerned should we be that something will go awry during the decommissioning, the physical decommissioning?
From our point of view, the danger has changed. We are really glad that this plant is closing for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But there's direct danger to the workers, as I mentioned before, when they're cutting equipment apart that can release radioactive dust and volatilize radioactive isotopes, and that can cause worker and community exposure. The other danger we're very concerned about is whether or not the casks, or rather the canisters that are going to then be stored into concrete casks, are sufficient, whether they can be adequately monitored and inspected for leaks. And there is no on-site solution. Oyster Creek has just gone through this with Holtec, where they asked for an overpack. I'm not sure that an overpack would be adequate if there was a problem, but Holtec refused to move even one overpack on site, and it's extremely difficult to transport nuclear equipment like that. It weighs too much to go over New Jersey roads, so it would have to be barged. It would be a very long, slow, difficult process. I think these are some of the many issues. The dry cask storage system on an open pad is vulnerable to terrorism. It's like a bunch of bowling pins. Now, whether or not, and how serious each of these concerns and many others that have been raised in testimony recently will bear out under real serious analysis, but we've got to take a look at that. We've got to relook at the pipeline. We've got to look at community exposure and the risks and dangers of transportation. So I'm really glad that the Decommissioning Oversight Board is going to be convened, and I want it to do the job that is needed because the NRC has such a history of granting waivers and exemptions and, not even following their own regulations. And for that, I don't know if Mondaire is still on the call, but if Congressman Jones would really pay attention to congressional oversight over the NRC in these very dangerous times. So yes, we are safer. We're not going to be prone to a reactor accident, but there still is a lot of radioactive material that is the legacy of 40 years of generating electricity using nuclear power. And it's a very toxic and dangerous legacy with a lot of unanswered questions. And we're going to help clarify those questions and also recommend the people who have the expertise to help New York make the very best decisions and be sure that Holtec doesn't do quick and dirty decommissioning and put the public at risk for their profit.
Could that spent nuclear waste be recycled?
Oh, if I may, West Valley is the worst brownfield site in New York, and that's where they were trying to do reprocessing, and they've been very unsuccessful. There are other aspects of the industry that are looking to reprocess nuclear waste for nuclear weapons. And all of that entails exposure. A lot of that work is done in or near those communities in Texas and New Mexico that are slated to be burdened with so much of the country's waste. I think, if we didn't have any other solutions, some of this risk might be worth undertaking, but we've got plenty of opportunity for renewable energy with storage and efficiency, and that's where we should be investing in the future so that those younger people that Laurie and Carlos, their future becomes safer and makes more sense. And this isn't just Manna Jo Greene talking, I'm talking on behalf of people like Amory Lovins and Mark Jacobson, who have done the research and proven that we absolutely can and must move to a renewable energy economy and just stop doing the dangerous work and using whatever resources we have available to make it safe, as safe as possible.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Carlos. Carlos, what makes you most optimistic? What are you most excited about in regard to replacement energy and in regard to alternative fuels? Tell me a couple efforts going on in and around New York City and the state that have you most encouraged.
Absolutely. So there's a few. I think a few that come to mind off the top of my head, right? You have NYSERDA's New York Sun program, which is in charge of helping the state get to the 6 megawatt of solar energy stipulated by the CLCPA. NEJA and our allies, we've been really almost in every step of the way, helping NYSERDA redevelop and rewrite their plan for equity and development, and really making sure, like I said, that a lot of the renewable energy development that we see in the forthcoming years are really hopefully being led by frontline communities. So That program, which just got reauthorized, I believe last year for almost $750 million, that's going to put a lot of funding. And actually, you know, we helped write that. And then one of our members applied for a grant to put a bunch of community solar on their affordable housing portfolio, and they got approved. So now we're in discussions with a bunch of developers about analyzing all the roof spaces. We're doing that in the Bronx. So that's one example. I think another one is, of course, right, the state through the CLCPA has a bunch of climate action councils, advisory panels to help the state create a road plan, or sorry, a roadmap about how the state's going to get to the 2030 and 2040 goals we have in the CLCPA. NEJA, we're in 6 of the 8 advisory panels. And a lot of the programs and the discussions, unfortunately, you have a lot of what we call false solutions, right? Things that are being pushed by the natural gas or the fossil fuel industry or the nuclear facility owners to really help their business platform stay in business in the clean energy future. But, you know, through our allies, you know, I see Jessica Azalea is here, so she's been an amazing ally, Riverkeeper, Sierra Club, Align, all of our allies, we've all really done really well about pushing back on a lot of those false solutions and making sure that the road plan we have for the future, again, actually has solutions that aren't going to affect negatively the most marginalized communities that have been affected historically. And then lastly, I think, you know, I think a really great example of how we are now switching from, like I said, that just transition is the Peak Coalition, which we're a part of. It's looking at the peaker plants, which are these really old and efficient power plants in New York City, and we're replacing them with a slew of different options. Like I said, on-site renewables, a bunch of energy storage, and then in the surrounding area, analyzing the area in a very technical sense of their energy demand, the building typologies, what kind of energy what kind of buildings use how much energy at what time, and then providing a bunch of different options to decrease that energy demand, so that way the peaker plant is in less demand because the area around it is demanding less energy. And when we go in to replace that peaker plant with cleaner energy, we are doing that much easier. And I think a really great example of the kind of headwind that we're doing, NYPA, which is the New York Power Authority, which owns, I believe, 8 peaker plants in New York City. We've signed an MOU with them to do really extensive modeling on all their peaker plants and do modeling on energy storage modifications and replacements. And we just started that process, and it's extremely technical, and we're going through that right now. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff that we've kind of written into law and are now forcing the city and the state to do. But it's the right kind of stuff that's really long overdue, and it's really amazing to be a part of and to help support a lot of our members that are really pushing the envelope on what can be done.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah.
Philip, I can't see you, but I think you're out there still.
I'm here, John. Yeah.
Oh, nice. I'm kind of curious because you were involved with this Indian Point fight going back a while, but you left New York and you took your skill set to Northern Virginia, Southern Maryland, Washington D.C.
The D.C. area. I live in Maryland, just outside D.C. Yeah.
Well, what did you you know? And there's now how many Riverkeeper, Baykeeper, water keepers? 300 odd, more than 300.
There are almost 400 water keepers around the world, and we have, I think, over 200 in the U.S. We actually have 19 different water keepers in the Chesapeake Bay region, so we're well represented down here. But yeah, we're doing well. Go ahead.
What did you take away from this effort, this Indian Point effort here on the Hudson River, that's applicable to the work you've done since on a different river?
Sure, that's a great question. I mean, I think you know, I learned perseverance, and I learned not to be afraid of these kind of David versus Goliath battles. I mean, we just successfully had a law passed in Virginia that requires Dominion Energy to clean up 28 million tons of toxic coal ash around Virginia. We had 2 coal power plants on the Potomac that were leaking coal ash toxins into the river for years, and that campaign took us 4.5 years, and that campaign was in many ways similar to Indian Point, not nearly as long, but you know, we had very incremental victories. You know, you learn to pace yourself and you figure out what you can accomplish, and you document the problems. And I think, you know, we just took a very methodical, strategic approach and fought the long fight, at least long for this area, and got a big cleanup. And we're trying to take that same approach with other issues. You know, we're fighting PFAS chemicals, forever chemicals down here, trying to get our arms around that, you know, how to deal with that in our environment. So I learned a lot, you know, mostly patience and the value of partners and the value of public support. I think is critical. Yeah.
Given that long history of work, what gives you optimism?
I think the people I work with, honestly, and the you know, the everyone from the attorneys to the scientists to you know, the amazing films that you make, the other filmmakers over the years that were involved with Indian Point, for example, just the, you know, the curiosity and the passion people have for trying to figure out these intractable problems, right, that we have, that we've all, I think we touched on tonight. That gives me optimism. And you know, one of my favorite writers, David Quammen, who writes these amazing books about natural history, you know, he talks about this sense of despair about species extinctions and climate change. And he says, you know, to him, it's much more interesting to fight, even if you lose, than it is just to sit back and wait for things to happen around you. You know, and I prefer to fight. It's much more interesting to me. So I'm optimistic. I mean, we're going to have a lot of challenges ahead. But you know, all the things that Carlos has talked about so eloquently, what Paul's talked about, I think, I mean, I'm excited. I left New York 6 years ago, and I'm excited to see that these plans are in place. And I think the river is just gonna rebound amazingly. So
yeah, well, that's something we don't really know yet what this. I mean,
right.
We're very positive, but it'd be interesting to watch and follow that.
Yeah.
And Paul, what's your team at Riverkeeper going to do with all this extra time on your hands now that the Indian Point is shut down?
We're going to restore fish populations. We're going to stop ban scammer. We're going to promote renewable energy in a way that actually helps the river short-term and long-term. Going to continue to do the wonderful Riverkeeper sweep, which is tomorrow morning. And thanks to the work that Jen Benson and her team are doing, we have 131 sites, and we anticipate easily over 2,000 people for the Riverkeeper sweep tomorrow morning. Water quality testing, patrolling. You know, when you think about what the Riverkeeper team does, and there are 30 of us, it may sound like a lot, but when you think about all the work that they do, it goes fast. And we won't, you know, we'll be back at the job first thing tomorrow morning for the Riverkeeper sweep, because there's work to be done.
And you know, it's not a big secret, but you're winding down your days at Riverkeeper. Where does this closure of Indian Point fit in the accomplishments under your watch there?
Well, I think if you couple this with the work that we did to help keep fracking out of New York, stop some of the pipelines that were proposed, couple that with the money that we brought into water infrastructure, those are all excellent things. Stopping the bomb trains, the anchorages, the storm barriers, these are all very exciting things. But the most important thing of all that I've tried to do, and that my team is just brilliant in doing, that our team is brilliant in doing, and our board is brilliant at doing, and all our volunteers are brilliant at doing, is to get the public involved, to make this a movement that's all inclusive and that's popular, and it really lives the principle that change comes from the community. So that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, you've heard me say this before, but I am, having toured our films up and down the Hudson River and around New York State, I've come away with the firm belief, though I have absolutely no empirical data to back it up, that there are more environmental activists per capita in the Hudson Valley than anywhere else in the country. And I think we also are a little spoiled. You know, we have these three major groups, Clearwater and Riverkeeper and Scenic Hudson. And then when we looked around to try and find the places to show our films, we came up with a list of 300 groups that work on environmental issues up and down the river. And I think we're spoiled a little bit. I think we take for granted that every community has this kind of activism, and it's just not true. I'm not sure what parts of the country we might get a little kickback from, maybe you know, Northern California or the coast or Portland or something. But I think we're at risk of being a little spoiled, which is in this regard actually a good thing.
And very briefly, when you think about all of the folks who care about the environment here, politicians from both parties in New York care about the environment, we really are fortunate because the challenges are so big. They need all of us, and it gives us a fighting chance. Even the safe decommissioning of Indian Point, as many of the questions have pointed out, is by no means assured. So sure, we're going to put our attention on sweep and on water quality, on habitat restoration, dam removal. We got a long way to go on Indian Point too, and a long way to go, of course, on renewable energy and energy efficiency. But we've got a fighting chance. And all of you, everybody who's been on this call, well over 200 people, all the panelists, we're blessed to have you. Even those who don't necessarily see the closure of Indian Point as a good thing, the folks who worked in the plant, the folks from this community, we're all in where we go from here. And we better hang together from here, because otherwise, as the expression used to go, we will all hang separately. So it's a pleasure to be working with everybody, and I feel very fortunate to be working with everybody.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we're about to expire. So, yeah.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks all of you, and thanks for those of you who tuned in. And I guess my only last words were, as Paul suggested, you know, the fight or struggle, however you want to term it, with Indian Point is not over. You know, I think tomorrow everyone's going to wake up and look at that region anew, but it's by no means ended. So I'm very curious to see what comes next on a variety of fronts, but we'll all be paying attention. So.
All right, thanks, John.
Yep, thanks again. It was very fun.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Well,
Good night, everybody.
thanks
Yeah.
everybody. for tuning in.